Chapter 33. July 26. The Foreign Office building, situated at the corner of Downing Street and rebuilt in the 1860s as an Italianate palace to suit the Regency tastes of Lord Palmerston, did not house the sort of demanding institution that required long hours of its employees. They could sleep late, we are told by Zara Steiner, a historian of the Foreign Office, that on weekdays official hours were from 12 to 6. On weekends one left for the country. On the weekend in question the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and practically everybody they knew, were in the countryside as usual. Asquith was playing golf, and Grey was fishing for trout. Winston Churchill was with his wife and children on the beach, building sand castles. So it was remarkable that the head of the Foreign Office, Sir Arthur Nicholson, in London, should have gone to his office to work on July 26, a Sunday. The telegraphed dispatches that awaited him contained grim news. Serbia had ordered mobilization the day before, even before replying to the Austrian ultimatum, and from Vienna came reports that Austria had broken relations with Serbia. War is thought imminent. Wildest enthusiasm prevails in Vienna, cabled the British ambassador from the Habsburg capital. From St. Petersburg, Russia cannot allow Austria to crush Serbia, and become predominant power in the Balkans. According to the cable, Serbia had ordered mobilization and Russia had ordered preliminary preparations for mobilization. Historians in the years to come were going to become experts on mobilizations, endlessly disputing the nuances of difference among various forms of readiness for war, of preparatory stages, of mobilizations less than fall, and of other postures short of marching on or firing upon a neighboring country. Nicholson swung into action. He had two expedients in mind, but they were mutually exclusive. If he pushed one, he blocked the other. So he had to choose. The one he did not adopt was to campaign for direct talks between Austria and Russia, the two great powers that were directly concerned. Instead, he proposed convening a conference in London of the ambassadors of the uninvolved great powers, Germany, Italy, and France, meeting with Britain, at which the quarrel between Austria-Hungary and Serbia could be resolved peacefully. This was the process that had brought a halt to the Balkan Wars of the year before. From his country house, Grey sent his go-ahead to Nicholson, who cabled the suggestion to the relevant foreign capitals. Asquith told Venetia Stanley that he was concerned that Russia is trying to drag us in. He wrote to her, "The news this morning is that Serbia had capitulated on the main points, but it is very doubtful if any reservations will be accepted by Austria, who is resolved upon a complete and final humiliation." The curious thing is that on many, if not most of the points, Austria has a good and Serbia a very bad case. But the Austrians are quite the stupidest people in Europe, as the Italians are the most perfidious, and there is a brutality about their mode of procedure which will make most people think that it is a case of a big power wantonly bullying a little one. Anyhow, it is the most dangerous situation of the last 40 years. That was not necessarily the view of Asquith's cabinet. That night, Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George was reported to have told a friend otherwise. He said that Austria had made demands which no self-respecting nation could comply with. He said the situation was serious, but that he thought there would be peace. In fact, he thought so very strongly. In Britain and the Origins of the First World War, 1977, Zara Steiner, looking at the weeks following the assassinations of June 28, 1914, suggests, only a calendar of events would catch the sense of rising tension, and illustrate the interaction between all the capitals which ended in the breakdown of the European state system. There is a strong element of truth in that insofar as Berlin and Vienna were concerned. But there was no rising of tension day by day in, for example, Paris or Rome or London. Austria and Germany successfully kept the secret of their plot from the other great powers for almost 4 weeks. From the killings the morning of June 28 until the morning of July 24, there was no significant rise in the level of tension. Then, suddenly, On the midsummer weekend of July 24, a full-blown war crisis was sprung on Europe's leaders. It caught them unawares. Until July 23, the British cabinet had spent no time at all on foreign affairs. On July 26 the Chancellor of the Exchequer still believed that peace would be preserved. In Russia, two weekending statesmen ran into each other that Sunday. The German ambassador found himself about to board the same train as Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister. It happened because their summer houses were near to one another. The ambassador took advantage of the situation to persuade Sazonov to reject Britain's proposals to convene a conference of the powers, a European forum. It would be unwieldy, argued the ambassador, the machinery would work too slowly. Instead, Russia should negotiate directly with Austria. London, it will be remembered, had decided not to launch a campaign for direct negotiations because it would block the more promising proposal for a conference. According to Germany's ambassador, Austria does not think of swallowing Serbia, but only wants to give her a well-merited lesson. Sazonov, reported the ambassador, promised to follow the advice, no conference, direct negotiations. Sazonov took a conciliatory line. He expressed willingness to see almost all of Austria's demands granted. In fact, he proceeded to postpone acting on the British conference proposal while he explored the possibility of direct negotiations with the dual monarchy. But Austria refused to make any concessions. Sazonov had been persuaded to waste a vital couple of days. Britain. Members of the Naval Reserve left for home immediately after their exercises. The fleets themselves were scheduled to disperse Monday morning. Sunday, First Sea Lord Prince Louis of Battenberg spoke twice by telephone with First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, who was at the seashore. Prince Louis gave him news of Austria's rejection of the Serbian reply. Either Churchill or Prince Louis then ordered the fleets not to disperse but to remain as they were. Churchill came to London, arriving at 10 p.m. He went to see Foreign Secretary Grey to ask whether it would be helpful if he made a public announcement of the order that had been given. Grey said yes. Churchill did so. It was a shot across the bow, aimed at attracting Germany's attention. Contrary to the views of his closest associates at the Foreign Office, who were skeptical of German intentions, Grey tended to give Berlin the benefit of the doubt. His strategy in 1914, as in 1913, was to move toward a joint Anglo-German approach on the theory that otherwise the Germans would see Britain as forming a bloc with France and Russia. In other words, precisely because of the informal alliance among Britain, France, and Russia, Britain had to move in the first instance toward Germany so as not to appear to be taking sides. Nonetheless, Berlin rebuffed Grey's conference proposal, claiming that it would be an arbitration, a laying down of the law to Austria. Grey denied it, but Jago refused to accept the denial. Meanwhile, a statement was published in Germany's quasi-official publication, the North German Gazette, backing Austria fully. Nicholson, the British Foreign Office head, told Grey that Berlin is playing with us. Though Nicholson did not say so, Grey's strategy would prove futile if Germany, instead of being a neutral like England, was a hidden belligerent, in fact, Austria's secret backer. And that, indeed, was the case. Paris. The political director of the French Foreign Ministry told the German ambassador that to any simple mind Germany's attitude was inexplicable if it did not aim at war. The ambassador denied it, but he knew nothing. Berlin had left him in the dark. Vienna. Berchtold was urged by Jago in Berlin to declare war immediately, before the other powers stepped in to impose a peace settlement. In turn, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister attempted to put pressure on his army chief, Conrad, who had been a persistent advocate of going to war in the past. Conrad claimed not to be ready. In Conrad's account, Berchtold, we should like to deliver the declaration of war on Serbia as soon as possible so as to put an end to diverse influences. When do you want the declaration of war? I, only when we have progressed far enough for operations to begin immediately, on approximately August 12. Berchtold, the diplomatic situation will not hold as long as that. Conrad replied that Austria had to hold back. Looking just at the Russian situation, what did Russia intend? It was necessary to wait until at least August 4 or 5. That will not do, Berchtold exclaimed. Germany's ambassador to Russia reported that he had held a long conference with Sazonov. The Russian foreign minister had been conciliatory. He had stressed that he was ready to exhaust every means necessary to prevent a war. He urgently entreated Germany, too, to do whatever was needed to accomplish that goal. Though the Serbs were fellow Slavs, Russian policy was not guided solely by its sympathies. It was guided by the need to uphold the balance of power and to protect those interests that were vital. The German ambassador reported, I particularly pointed out, that if Austria was really seeking a pretext for falling on Serbia, we should already have heard of the commencement of some action on the part of Austria. It was an ingenious way of taking advantage of Austria's maddening slowness to move. Vienna's civilian government was trying to get its army to act, and Germany, too, was pushing the Austrians to take up arms. Berlin. Moltke, the chief of staff, was back at work with his chief deputy from the morning of July 26. Moltke then went to the Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Office, to review matters with Jago. During the course of the meeting, Moltke supplied Jago with a draft ultimatum to Belgium to be used if and when war began. This envisaged a conflict with France, not with Serbia, a major war rather than a local one. Finally, Moltke met with the Chancellor, who had been on the telephone almost continuously ever since returning the day before. According to his wife, Moltke was very dissatisfied with the situation he found on his return. So were the other officers who returned that weekend and who had been holding meetings and exchanging views. In the 3 weeks that they deliberately had stayed away, Austria was supposed to have crushed Serbia, but instead had not even made the first move. Russia, which was to have been kept out of things, was taking preliminary military measures. Bateman's plans were falling apart. The presentation of a fait accompli, his original plan, had not occurred. Localization of the conflict, his improvised second plan, was not occurring either. Britain was considering diplomatic initiatives, and Russia was thinking of taking action. Chapter 34. July 27. Kaiser Wilhelm II insisted on returning from his cruise in northern waters. He cut short his voyage when it became evident that his government was not keeping him fully informed. Bateman, trembling figuratively if not literally, met him on his arrival to proffer his resignation. Wilhelm would not let him off so easily. According to Bülow, Bateman's predecessor, the Kaiser said something like, "You have cooked the broth and now you will eat it." Later, settled in his palace at Potsdam, Wilhelm brought himself up to date on the diplomatic cables, and met with the leaders of his government and of his armed forces. According to the plan formulated largely by Bateman on July the 5th to the 6th, Wilhelm should have returned to find the Habsburg army in occupation of Belgrade, supervising the carrying out of terms of surrender that had been agreed to by a crushed Serbia. It all would have happened too quickly for outside powers to prevent it. It would have been too late for them to do anything about it. Russia, and its allies would have bowed before the inevitable. But that was not what had happened. What Wilhelm found was that Austria-Hungary had passed up a chance to humble Serbia peacefully. Now Serbia was readying to take a stand, the British fleet was mobilized, and Russia had taken the first step toward preparation for war. Britain was pushing for a diplomatic conference that might settle the dispute on a basis less favorable than the terms Austria already had rejected on July 25. As they returned from their staged holidays, the leaders of the German-speaking powers had to decide upon their next move. This was to prove a decisive week. What key members of the German and Austrian governments identified as their immediate danger was that Grey might succeed in his four-power mediation proposal, thus preventing the outbreak of war. In the foreign offices of Vienna and Berlin, July 27 saw the beginning of a peace scare. For itself, Germany had rejected Grey's conference notion. The German government agreed to forward the proposal to Austria-Hungary, however, while it secretly sabotaged Grey's efforts to get Vienna to agree. Bateman explained to one of his officials why he felt obliged even to forward the proposal. As we have already rejected one British proposal for a conference, it is not possible for us to refuse to pass on the latest idea. If we rejected every attempt at mediation, the whole world would hold us responsible for the conflagration and represent us as the real warmongers. That would also make our position impossible here in Germany, where we have got to appear as though the war had been forced upon us. Bateman, who heretofore had been speaking of Austria going to war, suddenly was speaking of Germany going to war. The German government forwarded Britain's peace plans while privately advising the Austrians to pay no attention to them. The Austrian ambassador in Berlin cabled Berchtold in Vienna with a message in strictest privacy from Jago, who said that Germany would soon forward to Vienna mediation proposals from Grey. The German government assures in the most decided way that it does not identify itself with the propositions, that on the contrary it advises to disregard them, but that it must pass them on, to satisfy the English government. Berlin hoped to keep Britain from siding with France and Russia, if Germany candidly told Sir E. Grey that it refused to communicate England's peace plan, that objective might not be achieved. Jago reported that Grey had asked him to forward a plea for modification of Austria's ultimatum. He explained to his colleagues that he had sent the message to his ambassador in Vienna without instructing him to deliver it to the Austrians. Thus, Jago concluded, he could truthfully tell Grey that he had forwarded the British note to Vienna. Bateman continued to take the line he had the week before: the other powers should stay out of the conflict between Austria and Serbia. Britain should use its influence, therefore, to persuade Russia to accept localization. Grey pointed out that Serbia, in its reply to Austria's demands, had conceded practically everything, and Grey ascribed this to the pressure Russia had brought to bear upon Serbia. At Britain's request, Russia had restrained Serbia. Now Britain was asking Germany to use its influence to restrain Austria. But Germany rejected Grey's proposal. Jago claimed that Russia and Austria were about to enter into negotiations, and that their outcome should be awaited before any other move was taken. As before, he was using a negotiations proposal to block the conference proposal. London. At a cabinet meeting that morning, Grey told his colleagues that the moment had come to make up their minds whether they were prepared to stand by France and Russia if it came to a war. This was the first cabinet conclave devoted entirely to the war crisis in Europe. The governing Liberal Party tended to be pacifist in outlook. No treaty bound Britain to come to France's aid, and the cabinet overwhelmingly was opposed to intervening in a European war. Grey was still focused on preventing the outbreak of war, but believed that if he could not prevent it, Britain would have to participate in it. Prime Minister Asquith was strongly disposed to support his Foreign Secretary, but his chief concern was to keep his Liberal Party united behind whatever policy was adopted. After the cabinet meeting, Winston Churchill set about formulating plans for ensuring the readiness of the naval service. He was in his element. He had battlefield experience in India and the Sudan, and as a civilian his remarkable deeds in the Boer War had helped launch his political career. Though not a warmonger, he gloried in the clash of arms. That afternoon he set about placing guards at vulnerable points, and taking precautions against surprise attacks. His Admiralty joined with the War Office in convening a small group to consider how best to ask the press for self-censorship. There was to be no disclosure of information useful to an enemy. The press lord George Riddell, who was among those present, later recorded in his diary that a government spokesman apprised us that the continental situation was becoming very serious. He said that it might be necessary to move troops and ships, secretly, and asked how to keep the news from becoming public. Riddell drafted a letter to the newspapers which was promulgated and was the first official intimation to the press of the impending war. The result was remarkable. No information was divulged, and the Germans were unacquainted with what was being done. That night Churchill put his forces on informal alert. To the far-flung fleets of the Royal Navy around the world he cabled, "Secret. European political situation makes war between Triple Alliance and Triple Entente powers by no means impossible. This is not the warning telegram, but be prepared to shadow possible hostile men of war. Measure is purely precautionary." Paris. The German and Austrian ambassadors in Paris were kept in the dark about their own government's plans and thinking. This added an extra measure of confusion to events as seen in that effectively leaderless capital, whose heads of government still were at sea. Apparently, the Austrian ambassador was amazed that his own government had rejected Serbia's note of near surrender. He told his superiors in Vienna, "The far-reaching compliance of Serbia, which was not regarded as possible here, has made a strong impression. Our attitude gives rise to the opinion that we want war at any price." London. Lichnowsky, Germany's ambassador in London, as an Anglophile, was not always taken into Berlin's confidence. By July 27 he was strongly questioning the judgment of his superiors. How could he advocate localization of the conflict, as the Foreign Office told him to do, when the feud between Serbia and Austria could not be localized, and when Britain knew that Austria-Hungary had picked its quarrel in such a way as to force Russia to intervene? The small war might be leading to a big one. Our entire future relations with England depend on the success of Grey's move for a conference. If Berlin were to sacrifice everything else to its Austrian alliance, then it would never again be possible to restore those ties which have of late bound Britain and Germany together. Grey's tendency in a crisis had been to reach out for a partnership with Germany in dealing with it. Lichnowsky's point to his home government was that, if Berlin kept on course, in the future Grey would no longer do so. Senior officials at the British Foreign Office already were critical of Grey in this regard. So were some foreign leaders. At dinner that evening, a Russian diplomat told a British statesman that war is inevitable and by the fault of England, that if England had at once declared her solidarity with Russia and France and her intention to fight if necessary, Germany and Austria would have hesitated. Berlin. At least since the War Council of December 1912, Germany's military leaders had focused on blaming Russia for the European conflict they foresaw and regarded as inevitable. This had been, and remained, Moltke's line. It was echoed on July 27 by Admiral von Müller. Germany should, he told his diary, remain calm to allow Russia to put herself in the wrong, but then not to shrink from war if it were inevitable. Weidmann agreed with the military on this. In all events Russia must ruthlessly be put in the wrong, he told Wilhelm. Vienna. The British ambassador, after conversations with other ambassadors, cabled Grey that the Austro-Hungarian note was so drawn up as to make war inevitable. That the Austro-Hungarian government are fully resolved to have war with Serbia. That they consider their position as a great power to be at stake and that this country has gone wild with joy at the prospect of war with Serbia.